Ja.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. In a small circle, but broadcasts live to Germany and the rest of the world. We're now today meeting at the Elector Palatinate Castle in Mainz. So far, this opening always took place at the Rheingold-Halle. Now we've moved over to the other side of the street, close by, and I'm really happy to see you all in the numbers permitted by the COVID protection ordinance to discuss changes and network on the changes in the wine law. I'm happy to welcome our Minister for Agriculture, Mrs. Klöckner, Julia Klöckner, and I would like to thank Lord Mayor, Mr. Klöckner, and the Officer for Cultural Affairs, Mrs. Matz, and I'm happy that President Schneider, General Secretary, and Presidents of Glycerad from the Moselle, Mr. Seifert of the Rheingau region, and Mr. Steinmann from the Franconia region, and I hope I have not forgotten any of the presidents from the wine-growing regions of the VDP. And I'm also happy to see Mr. Walz of the Landjugend, and he will also exchange with us later at the discussion. Since we're so limited in terms of the number of seats available, we decided to have a live broadcast. And some colleagues from abroad will be listening to us who would have loved to meet us personally and actually taste the new vintage. And this is why we have English interpretation for you today. What a year, an exciting Big Bang year with many challenges. At the end of the day, we are happy that we made it and how we made it through the crisis. Of course, there are major changes for us wine-growing estates. Distribution structures have changed. Food services dwindled in importance. Contacts with end users have increased. Online marketing, e-commerce has.
Export ist zurückgegangen, fast 10% in diesem Jahr. Aber es ist durch ein unglaubliches Wachstum im Inland ausgeglichen worden, auch bei uns VDP-Weingütern. Wer hätte das gedacht? Wir haben also in diesem Jahr 5 Millionen Flaschen mehr verkauft, von 32 Millionen auf 37 Millionen Flaschen in einem Jahr. Das hätten wir uns nicht zu träumen gewagt am Anfang dieser Krise. Ja, es sind Zeiten, in denen wir auch immer wieder darüber nachdenken, wie es mit uns und dem Weinbau weitergeht. Und so haben wir am letzten Mittwoch auf unserer Mitgliederversammlung in Würzburg eine ganz weitreichende Entscheidung getroffen. Schon derzeit sind 32% der VDP-Betriebe ökologisch zertifiziert und weitere 29% haben eine Nachhaltigkeitszertifizierung. Mit unserem Beschluss, jetzt eine Agenda 2025, haben wir beschlossen, dass bis zum Jahr 2025 jeder VDP-Betrieb sich einer Nachhaltigkeitszertifizierung unterzieht. Wir sind in engem Gespräch mit verschiedenen Zertifizierern und arbeiten daran, dass der VDP-Adler zukünftig dafür steht, dass ein Betrieb, der diesen Adler trägt, nachhaltig wirtschaftet. Nachhaltigkeit ist natürlich in unserer DNA. Viele Betriebe blicken auf viele Jahrhunderte Geschichte zurück, teilweise bis zu 1000 Jahre Weinbau in der Familie. Wer müsste weniger an oder wer müsste dann
Who would have been more interested in sustainability than we do? This is really part of our DNA, and this is why we also think that this is an area where we can actually be in a leading role for German wine again. This is a beacon campaign to motivate as many colleagues as possible to follow us and to move towards sustainability. Last year, we also adopted our sparkling wine statute. We also feel that we have to chart the course in which to move. This is high-quality sparkling wines from Germany on a level playing field with the best sparkling wines of the world, on a level playing field with champagne. This is an interesting project. I hope that we will soon have an opportunity to taste these wonderful wines and sparkling wines again, also during Corona times. So what over the 1.5 1.5 years, well, what has actually kept us on our toes for the past 25? It was a law dating back to 71. In the 90s, many colleagues became aware that in 1971 we actually opted for an erroneous course. It seemed fair. Every wine is only judged by the sweetness of the must for the category and the quality of the wine in the glass. But so many criteria have changed. The sweetness of the must is today, even for varieties, the classical varieties, is the easiest thing to achieve these days. The system is no longer valid for differentiation. In 94, therefore, the VDP actually parted with the Oechsle pyramid and in tough discussions parted with the use of the Großlage. VDP colleagues back then also thought that the world would end if the Großlage would end to exist, if consumers would no longer drink their wine. At the end of the day, sales volumes increased. In 2002, we actually decided upon our classification statute, and this means that terroirs are reserved for the best only. 20 years ago, roughly, the German Wine Growing Association actually created the German Wine Vision 2020. And when I prepared for my speech today, I browsed the web and found an article from the Heilbronner Stimme newspaper. The then Secretary of State, Mr. Trautz, he was well known to the VDP, talked and met with cooperative representatives in Heilbronn, and back then said, nothing can be changed. But where has this led us? 20 years of discussions have gone by, but we're not discussing because for many, many years this discussion was only about varying ideas, people being approached, but the only reaction was a no, a refusal to change anything. In 2008, with the EU directive, the denomination of origin principle was also introduced in Germany. Back then, we changed the wine law accordingly, that nobody should notice. We do as if nothing has changed. This was the thesis back in 2008 and 2009. But back then, it was already laid down that consumers must rest assured that when there is a label on the bottle, this label is correct. And this is why the implementation of this was really high time. And this is, Mrs. Klöckner, we really have to actually show all of our respect for the work we've done. I've accompanied this process all of the time. I've seen and experienced many things. And in editorial in the Weinwirtschaft magazine 2 weeks ago, where Hermann Pilz quotes Fürst Bismarck, the two things where you prefer not being present, this is laws and sausages. And I really have to admit that I felt very much the same during this process. And insofar, with the law we now have in front of us, we have really taken a courageous first step. But honestly, it's only a first step after difficult discussions in the German Wine Growing Association. This is why I would also like to thank President Schneider and Secretary General Schröder for hosting these many meetings and topics. It wasn't easy, and we can still feel the labor pain until this very day. Well, there are still many, many opinions on this, and this was probably the first time for policymakers that policymakers had to take decisions in wine growing. Most of the time, policymakers served as the ball pen of the wine growing industry. Policymakers were just jotting these ideas down, but the decisions were taken by wine growers. But this time it was different. Policymakers had to take the decisions. Despite the compromise, at the end of the day, many things were questioned. VDP has acquired its own experience in leaving the German Wine Growing Association. We, 20 years ago, also parted with the German Wine Growing Association because we did not see that the German Wine Growing Association was moving at all. And probably it was the change that occurred in the German Wine Growing Association because their discussions and their forward-looking decisions being taken. And this is why we're taking part again. When in '94 we started with our classification, Luke Johnson was here, and I liked his his regards. He would have loved to come to Mainz. He is very old but very fit, still observing German wine growers. Hugh Johnson back then said, somebody has to start somewhere, and this is what we did in '94. It's about the denomination of origin, it's about focus and limitation. It is about not actually labeling every wine with the highest denominations and to actually put metal labels on every bottle. Of course, the change of the wine law only refers to 5 to 10% of the wine volume. The 5% of individual terroir wines are unaffected. The profile is simply sharpened, and whereas the 90% of the local wines have no restrictions whatsoever. And this is why we shouldn't hope to see too much after this first step, because after all, we lacked the courage somewhat to actually look after all of the areas. The Windners are congruent with most of what we think, but nevertheless, the winemakers could only say yes to a partial concept. And they actually wanted to have everything on top of what was available before in the wine law. But one thing is for sure, we feel that more wines and in the denomination of origin or of region, not every wine in a supermarket sold at $2.49 or $1.99 be ranked in the highest quality category that the EU foresees. Cooperatives are complaining even more, although most changes were now changes on a national level, but the biggest change in the area of the Großlager was actually brought about by EU legislation. And if our state was doing his homework, would have had to be applied for 10 years with sanctions. So the wine growing authorities would not be allowed to issue those certificates. I always say the example that only in '96 from the Bavarian constitution, death penalty was eliminated. Thank God they never actually carried it out. And for at least 12 years, this principle has not been applied, fortunately. The problem is the following. It is such a shame that we couldn't make more progress in this discussion, because many colleagues in this cooperative area would like to see changes, but some few want to stick to the old status quo and then motivate the others to stand by their sides. So what is the Großlager worth? Well, it brings no added value. The wines actually deliver the same prices as the wines sold without this denomination. It is such a shame that these marketers have not understood the big opportunities lying in the marketing of locations, of origins. To my mind, Großlagen are too small for today's needs, and the segments are not really high profile. Especially for this medium segment, we have to introduce change and come with new definitions, work out new definitions. Sure, we cannot actually do business as usual. And if we change anything, then you can't try to change something and leave something the way it is. This is a contradiction in terms. At a very early stage, we tabled a proposal, unfortunately not received any counter-proposals over the 20 years. We do not know and cannot guarantee that this new course charted will be successful, but what we do know is that the old course was not successful. So we need a profile for every wine on every level. And insofar, as I said, we need German wines and protected denominations of origin. We have to allow more to become more clearer and actually delimit profiles. It makes no sense to sell wines for 149 and for 149 euros are sold in on the same quality level. So the new wine law offers opportunities for all producer groups to find their niche in this new system without colliding with other wine growers or producers, establishing in themselves side by side, fighting for German wine. And one thing is for sure, this wine law is not a wine law for the VDP. The VDP has created its own world and needs no change. And so far, it is an error to believe if Mr. Hübinger says that VDP has actually asserted its own interests. Own interests? Well, I can hardly see any. We rather see ourselves as the protagonist fighting for many young colleagues who need support from the wine law. The gap in German wine growing is widening. Sure, the VDP is manages 6% of the vineyards in Germany, produces 3% of the volume of wine, but generates 13% of the sales from producers. Many young outfits in all regions actually follow our model of origin. Well, together with those, I would say add another 5 times the amount and 3 times the value added. Wine for 80 cents per liter need to be sold. How many of this must be sold to create the same value that the VDP actually generates with the operations that actually follow the system? If you look at this marketing type as a whole in Germany, we are really a world champion in terms of price stability. For almost 30 years, German wines have cost the same, 1.99, 2.49, 2.99 in German food retail. The same refers to a jar wine, or in a cask. These prices have not changed for 25 years. At the same time, salaries have gone up dramatically, and this is not only the case for seasonal workers, minimum wages, and we like minimum wages to go up. It also works with the salaries that we pay our employees who actually work at estates. A tractor used to cost 1/5 of what it costs today, and the wine prices are still the same. Colleagues have only survived because they have rationalized, but this only worked because the estates grew substantially. And if you can't pay for this, you've got actually Pinot Gris from Bulgaria for the same price. We've actually trained consumers to only look for a variety, and this is a huge problem, and it needs to change. A few weeks ago, we had the main committee meeting at the Palatinate Wine Growing Association, and I was surprised to see how many colleagues stood up at the meeting and actually stood in for change. And they were not VDP colleagues. At the end, 3 colleagues with VDP background actually convinced 23 colleagues to vote in favor of a change. Only a few were against. Not even all of the cooperative members were in favor of leaving everything the way it is. And I do hope that this is that we will make more progress and that we can finally tackle this this problem. They'll roll up our sleeves and forget about discussions in the past, although it doesn't look like this right now. But maybe the smoke has to sink first, settle first. We are convinced that the image of a wine-growing company is actually created top-down. Great wines have to create a charisma, have charisma, and thereby create scope and possibilities for other wines. VDP is the lawyer, the attorney, spokesperson for the others to make head start. One issue in the German wine law or regulation that really affects us is the topic of the Großes Gewächs and the Erstes Gewächs, the Grand, the Premier. Of course, we thought that the tip of the pyramid should be the terroir wine, and the idea was that we should actually look at sharpening the profile of the terroir wines to actually then find the the Erste Gewächse, the Premier, and then the Grands. And so far, I'm really excited how we will actually make this happen this time. We hope that we won't make progress too fast, because the way the wine regulation stands, it can't continue like this. We've taken over the rules for the categorization. Unfortunately, we seem to have not learned our lesson. Rheingau, Erstes Gewächs, it was only of limited success. If we do not forge an alliance with all of the wine growers, the VDP included, then we won't make this project a success. And again, I would like to refer to Mr. Pilz in his article, where he only focuses on the image in this area. VDP produces 600 Großgewächse with 2,500 bottles. This is 1.5 million bottles sold at an average price of 25 euros from the estate to the various structures. End user price stands at 35 euros. This is 40 million turnover. If you then add the Erste Gewächse, the Premiers, then we're looking at the same amount, 80 million euro sales from the estate. This is not a little business. If this is lost, you can't say, well, no problem, we'll survive. Rheingau, the Rheingau region with its Erstes Gewächs, its Premier wines, has only produced 30,000 bottles, 2% of the volumes of the VDP. So we are open for a joint Grand and Premier Cru, but it needs to be actually tackle this topic with a lot of courage, and we have to be aware that we do not actually broaden these volumes too much. We're already having the first conversations how to produce a Grand Cru for Aldi or Lidl. We need protection, and we have to resharpen the wine regulation. This also requires a consistent basis for all regions in Germany, and we must not just go for the smallest common denominator, because we don't want to sell it off quick and cheap. Our proposal is that we jointly look at the best vines, then actually work out or cut the profile, sharpen the profile of the Grand Crus, the Premier Crus, before we actually look to the Grand Crus. This needs to be recognized by those who are interested in doing this. It is clear. It is clear that you cannot actually start with the category for all of Germany. But nevertheless, a vine that actually produces or is to produce a Grand Cru or Premier Cru needs to have a certain credibility. They're cheap vineyards and they're expensive vineyards. So there is a difference between the two. And so far, we need the observation audits of vineyards. We have various models, the Lagenkarte of the Rheingau region, for instance, the tax unit appreciation, the plot after plot consolidation. We are experienced in rating vineyards. It's not that we have to reinvent the wheel. Insofar, we need terroir committees in the regions who actually pursue this and actually develop a profile for the region. We need really good tasting bodies, because otherwise tasting is difficult, because these wines are tasted when they're still young, and you have to know how they develop in the future. So we're reaching out our hand, like in the whole process of drawing up the new wine law, and we accept the challenge. But we see the risk that what we've acquired will be destroyed, and this is why policymakers and authorities need to accompany us. In the worst case, we would actually say goodbye to the process again. We could have our own labels protected, and we also know that consumers know Jufferson Stein or Schlossstein, and they buy these wines because they have developed a relationship and a trust, regardless of whether the label says Second Cru or Premier Cru. Here, again, the operations or the outfits that are well established don't need all of these decorations. So it is a huge opportunity, but it's also associated with major risks. The kid is well above the fountain. We can bring it away to the safe, but it still runs the risk of falling into the fountain. We've achieved a lot in German wine growing, and in terms of this wine law, it's not about us, but about everyone. We think that we can only make progress together, and that we can only achieve matters together. And so far, we hope that those who actually have left the association will join it again. Cooperatives, to our mind, are also an important component in German wine growing. It's a stabilization factor for smaller producer. It provides structure for the market, but we need an open discussion about the things that are progressing, not always look out for veto. We are reaching out the hand and look forward to the discussion. So I look forward to exciting inputs by Mrs. Klöckner and Dr. Daniel Deckers, and that over a glass of wine we can network. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dankeschön.
Thank you. Water instead of wine. Yeah, you have to work for your wine. Lord Mayor, Mrs. Matz, officer, VDP President Mr. Christmann, and the German wine growing president, dear Mr. Schneider. And I would like to all greet you, dear vintners, here today, present today, and those watching us. The wine lovers. It would have been lovely to be here. Well, theory is one thing, and theory is the other. Analog wine tastings are okay, or digital wine tastings are okay, but analog wine tastings are far better. I have gladly accepted this invitation, and let me say a few words on the vintage. But the German wine growing is so heterogeneous, so different, so fragmented. If I am at a meeting organized by the cooperatives or of the sellers, of the vintners, or here with the VDP, then you have the most various attitudes towards German wine growing. Because therefore, let me say one thing very clearly. I'm responsible for all of you. And this also means to also observe and understand various views, whether one assert itself. It's about arguments and the objectives you want to achieve jointly. You described it so nicely, Mr. Christmann, with the new wine law. Everybody wants a reform, but nothing should change. This is a specific achievement to be made. When I came into office in 2018, and there were some draft bills, they were really actually, they were transferred from one term of office to the next. And I decided that I would not actually prolong this change of handing over, knowing everybody warned me and said, you'll have trouble, and I said, well, this is part of my job. So I decided that we would actually introduce the reforms, because sooner or later you're getting tired. Even an association gets tired. You're very close when you're talking about descriptive targets, objectives, but you have to leverage this momentum when you discuss and tackle details, because then things get hot. But at the end of the day, we have to strike a compromise, and this is why it was so important to me to come up with a decision, because after some time, nobody will be prepared anymore to actually get together. That's the point. That's the issue. And I'll say a few more critical things about the step of moving an association. We have a beautiful analogy with the Farmers Association in Germany. By fragmenting, by proposing demands that are contradictory, you're not actually becoming any stronger. So stay together. And I'm happy to be here. Let me kick off by commenting on the 20 vintage. It was outstanding, this vintage, really excellent. The last year was a year of exception in many ways. COVID, buzzword, special conditions under which you had to market wines, depending on the VDP outfits relied on food service. You felt this immediately. But private consumption has changed as well. It was a challenging year. The yield situation varied widely by regional terms, whereas in Württemberg, the smallest yield was achieved for 30 years. The yield in the Palatinate here in Rhineland-Palatinate was slightly above the 10-year average, so a wide bandwidth. And the situation of vintners, the economic situation of vintners, varied widely in the COVID years, so a very heterogeneous picture. Festivals were called off, special wine restaurants were closed down, and tourism was zero. And this could not be compensated for by e-commerce or selling of the estate. What was positive to note is that many wine-growing regions succeeded in selling their vintages 100%. There were shifts, but you had to move. The neighboring markets, France, Italy and France, I met my colleagues on Monday in Luxembourg because we talked about the agricultural reform, and we also talked about wine, and they said they had not managed to do this the way Germany did. And compared to food service and other sectors, the wine sector, with some peaks, actually got out with little damage, with a black eye, so to speak. And I'll talk about customs a little later. The 2020 vintage stands for a high quality level, because after all, this is also important. and they're wonderful wines that we can expect for this vintage. This vintage easily competes with 2018, 2019. It was a challenging year with 8.5 million hectoliters. The overall year was slightly below average. But at 83, the must gravity was high. Let me talk about the wine law. I asked my employees at the ministry, what is the main reason to change things? Of course, we have to comply with legislation in Europe. We cannot actually complain about other countries for violations, and we do the same thing. And this has always been my aim. Some have had some challenging discussions about fertilizers, for instance, in agriculture. So we cannot simply say, well, in this particular case, Europe is not so important. That's one point. But the other point that moved me were the figures. I looked at the exports from Europe to third countries. Exports, wine exports. Very well, extremely well. Only one country could not benefit, but exports were even down, and that's the German wines. So this must keep us busy. Have our young vintners a future? Vintners love their wine, but they won't survive if they only drink their own wine. And this is why the question is for me, what about tomorrow's wine drinkers? And one thing up front, because this is my topic today, it's all about moderate wine consumption, and it's about not drinking wine and driving. And I know what's going to happen after this appearance and the letters I will receive on my desk. No, wine is a delicatessen. But this industry is a very responsible one. Let me focus on that we have to create a perspective, a future perspective for the young vintners, the ones who actually are successors, who are investing, who are taking over outfits. And if we can now see that Germans drink more German wine, fine. But there's also a strong interest in imported wines. I don't want consumption nationalism, don't get me wrong. But the question is, are our wines properly understood? Are our offers understandable? Especially the young vintners get free of this classic denominations. They have created brands, fancy brands, which is fine. But the question is, how can we sharpen the profile? I always run a consumer survey every year at the beginning of the year. It's more about food in general, but wine is also food stuff. The desire of consumers for a stronger denomination is really high. They've never been so keen on regional wines and a clear labeling of origin. If in the U.S. People ask me, the home region, is this Germany, is it Europe? If I'm in Mainz, I say, in Berlin, I say Rhine and Palatinate. So it's always a question of perspective. But the wish for regionality, for a clear profile, can clearly be felt. So what perspectives will the next years bring in terms of weather and precipitation? I don't have a crystal ball. We do our research, but we can only influence it to a limited extent. But what we can actually make or provide planning security by taking the right decisions, because if we don't adapt, then we will have a bubble that will burst sooner or later. So when I actually take a decision, then I prefer taking a decision and being in trouble than ending up being no longer possible to take a decision. Then 2020, we had this major project, the wine law and the wine regulation. And I don't want to repeat what you said before. In 2008, we had this system change, and in the wine market reform, back then I wrote my BA paper on the European wine market reform. So I was confronted with many things again when I looked at the latest developments. But the Germanic and the Romanic system of quality and the denomination of origin, this was given up, and the origin model was the only yardstick. And as you rightly said, many didn't even realize the wine law reflected two important parts in its original form, not consistently. That was the change from the Germanic to the Romanic system. And the second point, the growing responsibility of producers for their protected denomination of origin in the so-called protected communities. Add to this that we also had to do justice to national developments. I mentioned dwindling exports, almost halved. These are shocking figures. I mean, exports were halved. And to compensate this with dwindling production, this would not have been the right answer for me. Telling vintners to produce less, but it happened. The new planting rights, we deliberately said 0.3% instead of 1%. Clear decisions. This is clear decisions that receive broad-based support. And at this juncture, I would like to thank you very much for the constructive conversations. When I actually took office, I relaunched the whole process, and it was quite interesting. The first meeting was fantastic, and I thought, oh, we can make it easily, Mr. Schneider. That was in Bonn. The way they're speaking, it's a big alliance. But then when we talked about the details, I saw that it was in trouble. For those listeners, too, this is the VDP. They actually have acquired experience with labeling. They are the top of the cream of the cream. But Germany is bigger. Let me look at the table wines, the direct marketers. Let's look at the vintners, the cooperatives, the huge bandwidth. The deeper we actually drilled down, Mr. Schneider, the more we found the fragments. But you at the VDP are pioneers in protecting wines, and many of your companies are beacons that actually stand for the image for the whole region. And with your pyramid of the estate, the local wines, the 1 and the 2G wines, you have already described basically what we proposed with our wine law and the wine regulation. Your association with your long-standing experience was a reliable partner to talk to ask questions and receive replies and inspirations in the process. So which were the focal points? I could actually cover this in detail, but the rest of the Sunday would also be nice to spend with a cup of coffee. Well, the most heatedly disputed topic was the pyramid of origin, and I know that views still differ widely on this one, although more and more producers have implemented it. For many conversations, I know the problem: too complicated, too limited, too much hassle, and so hard to explain to consumers without resting assured that you can obtain higher prices. Then, of course, another problem was that Moselle vintners would not do or forgo the Peace Porter Michelsberg, although the vines are not located there. So, but it's also about clarity. Is this really the region? And in view of a clear denomination of origin, this will in future no longer be possible. So a rule that actually complies with your views at the VDP, and at other points we actually struck compromises. Then another point was the Prädikate, the predicates. Spätlese, for instance. This was only to be used for wines with residual sweetness, and many said no. We successfully market Spätlese, dry Spätlese. And when you actually retain this rule. You conserve an old tradition without undermining new objectives. So the ideas among the regions and the groups, the ideas really were very, very deviating. German wine growing is fragmented, heterogeneous, and I think that we've stayed credible with our denomination of origin. I know, Mr. Schneider, that it wasn't easy for you, for your association, for the Secretary General. It was difficult as well. And that some leave the association, although they supported the compromise. They supported the compromise. This is a high form of dialectics, saying yes and then leaving the association. I do not believe that at the end of the day, those leaving the association will fare better, because jointly you're always stronger. And there are many, many examples showing where this disintegration weakened associations. I have heard of other associations that want to leave the VDP. We don't intervene as policymakers. I can only warn you, if you like my warning, don't do it. And on a bilateral base, I can give you horrible examples why. I know about the increased efforts and more work, because it actually goes hand in hand with the limitations of various varieties and a delimitation of highest yields or top yields. But I am sure that the reform will pay off for vintners, especially for the young ones. I talk to many young vintners who are keen on having a sharper profile. They said, fancy names, we'll actually opt for our avenue, which is okay, because at the end of the day, the product has to find its consumer, its buyer. I am convinced, as I said, that this will pay off, and the higher prices that you can generate on the market as VDP companies are a clear case in point. Of course, the market is differentiated. Consumers are differentiated. There are also wines justified in the lower price segment, because there are different budgets and the understanding varies. In some, only through the price, the entry price points are allured to the wine as such and to higher qualities. I'm a critic of dumping prices when it comes to food, when it comes to meat, and also when it comes to wine. Because we're fighting for minimum wages and fewer fertilizers, fewer pesticides, more sustainability, but this is at a price. But on the other hand, these prices are like carved in stone, because they have a psychological effect. I think that at the end of the counter, on the other side of the counter, you also have to educate your consumers, because you know the question about the hen and the egg. So I'm also skeptical when I look at wines for €1, whatever. We have outstanding quality wines that are easy to identify by consumers, and to really anchor a reference to the region and an upgrading of the estate and of the local wines was the right development. I think that the professionals are called upon now, Mr. Christmann, to actually instill the new rule for the 1Gs and the 2Gs, the premiers and the Grand Crus, with new life. I don't think that we have a sender and recipient problem here. But we have understood the message, but you now have to fill this with life. And I am convinced about the result of the reform. This reform is better than no reform at all. And I think we've really created a solid basis. Let us now walk on this way jointly. So much from me for the wine law. Knüsselrath. He loves to write letters to me, and if he doesn't get a reply letter in a week's time, he actually sends out the dogs, all of the other parliament members. Well, be realistic, please. If we actually tell Mr. Trump to lower the tariffs, this won't happen. I talked with Ursula von der Leyen, with my new American colleague. I discussed this really intensely with him. Of course, the USA have other interests too. And I also made it clear to Peter Altmaier that my witness now aptly pay the price for his sector of agriculture asserting their interests. And I was not amused, let me tell you. And I'm very grateful that the Chancellor also backed me up. We've now found a solution. It's not a permanent solution, I have to admit. The ban on customs, on sanctions, was agreed upon for 5 years, which is okay. And with this, there won't be any customs to be paid on wines, because this was a hard hit for German witness. I talked to a witness from my region. What this really means, a container on the way to the USA and right across on the pond, you find out how many thousands of euros you've just lost. And I had this prepared for me. The USA are of particular importance for our Rhine-Palatinate witness. The US market is by far the #1 market for these wines. And we could see what such customs activities do. They account for 16% of exports, 21% of export revenues with German wines, and the customs at 25%. Needless to say, this really caused a slump in exports. EU-wide exports actually dwindled by 54%, 20% less German white wines. And this agreement is the first step to achieve a long-term solution. The EU and the US now have 5 years to come up with a permanent solution. This is good, this is the right thing to do, and it is important. And the message was understood. I have touched upon only a few points. I have not been able to answer all of your answers, but I want to encourage you. First of all, thank you. You're a fantastic face for Germany, for the wine sector, for Germany. And I actually experienced this in all of our conversation. If we didn't have the wine, a lot of international understanding would be missing. And I would also like to thank you for your steps you've taken as VDP in terms of the denominations of origins. Thank you very much. And I would also like to thank you for preparedness to talk to all others in the industry. Sit down around the table. This is really important. You could do your own thing, but to sit down with everyone is so important. Let me conclude. Dear Mr. Schneider, I hope that the Wine Growing Association will stay together, stay tuned. The income raised is so important. If the Wine Growing Association didn't exist, it would have to be invented. So have smart decisions, always trust the end result rather than your reflex. And I'm there and available for you whenever you think, yes, I would like your support. But that policymakers used to be the ball pens for other people's decisions. Well, not in my term of office. Don't say this to politicians if you like them, because you will end up getting less. At the end of the day, industries have to actually contribute their knowledge as an input, but the policymakers need to decide at the end of the day. Thank you very much. Lots of luck, entrepreneurial luck for your work, because without your entrepreneurial success, your kids or grandchildren will not want to continue your business. Thank you very much. Beautiful. Yeah, I'm happy. Dear Mrs. Klöckner, I have brought a box with a VDP a Grand and a Premier Cru. Well, it was probably a misunderstanding. In fact, in the past, policymakers waited for the VDP to agree, and then policymakers actually put it into practice. But now we have really taken decisions which were not always so liked by policymakers. So this is why it is a new era. Thanks very much that you mentioned the exports as well. It is very important to know, because many of our outfits were affected by these export sanctions. Thank you very much again. I am happy that we also have an exciting presentation by Dr. Daniel Deckers, who has actually covered wine history and wine law for many years, and he is a lecturer at the Geisenheim University. And I am really excited to hear your new lesson on the exciting developments over the past few weeks and months. Thank you very much.
Sehr geehrte Frau Ministerin.
Minister, Lord Mayor, presidents of various organizations, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends of German wine. Although it may not be entirely appropriate to the seriousness of the situation, I will not conceal the fact that I received the news of the withdrawal of some cooperative associations from the German Wine Growers Association with a certain amusement. At least from the perspective of the participant observer. I was immediately reminded of the other withdrawal from the German Wine Growers Associations mentioned by Mrs. Christmann, namely of the VDP from the DW at the end of the 1980s. But then, as now, the core of the issue was a topic that has polarized experts like few others since the wine law of 1971. Großlagen. In '69, there was a first draft. Then, due to ECG law, it had to be revised and entered into force in '71. And this is a topic that has polarized experts like no other. It is not possible to discuss the details of this term here, and I will not actually delve into this any further, because you could hold an entire wine law seminar on it. Only one general remark is permitted at this point, as the interface between the producer in the broader sense and the consumer. Wine labeling law has always been the field in which high stakes have been played since the first wine law of 1893. And let me give you an example. And I do hope that some of you, when I actually look into the rear mirror, will have the impression that many of the things that have happened are like a metaphor for what is happening today, and probably opens up an avenue into the future. And I will talk about original bottling, nature wine, the Großlage, again, the function of the wine law as a seismograph, as a societal change, the famous Spätlese, and the Wiesen judgment. Historically, the question is quite young, the judicial question of what really wine is. That is, what can be marketed as wine at all, under which conditions and under which denominations? A legal definition has only been available since 1901. It's about the fermentation of grape juice. But this already had drastic consequences at the time, because all of a sudden, all those who had specialized in the production of so-called analysis-proof wines that is, alcoholic beverages produced without the juice of fresh grapes, but which passed as wine as long as they exceeded certain minimum extract values. They were out of the game. What remained, in theory, was the so-called real wine trade. However, their interests did not coincide with those of some producers, namely those who produced the so-called natural wines and put them on the market by auction. Since 1897, these producers had formed associations in various regions in order to counter the growing market power of retail. In concrete terms, the dispute was not about the term natural wine, as we might think today, but the term original bottling. In a time of rampant wine counterfeiting and false denominations of origin, the so-called natural wine auctioneers had gained a reputational edge by stipulating that their wines could only be described as original bottlings if they had been bottled in the producer's cellar and the bottles had been sealed with the producer's cork, branded cork. Only then, according to the quality promise, were they counterfeiting proof. The consumers, of course, believed them. The prices were higher around the turn of the century than for many other of the highly counterfeited bottled wines. The representatives of the wine trade, however, wanted to profit from this capital of trust. They, too, wanted to be able to call natural wines original bottlings if they had been bottled in their cellars with the producer's permission. However, the 1909 wine law did not comply with this demand. But in 1910, the 4 regional associations of natural wine sellers joined to form the VDNV, among others, because they wanted to join forces and continue to reserve the term original bottling for themselves. Listen, the representatives of the Moselle, the Rhine-Palatinate, Rhine-Hessen, and the Rheingau did not necessarily like each other, quite on the contrary. After a series of disastrous harvests, they were fiercer competitors than ever, also because of slumps in exports. Common interests were what brought them together at the same table in Koblenz in 1910. In fact, as the producers of what was recognized as the best wines of the world, and you can read this in any English-speaking publication until the 80s of the 19th century, the natural wine auctioneers were able to maintain their position, which was not market dominant, but nevertheless largely politically dominant until long after the Second World War. Only the adoption of the wine law of 1971 produced the turning point that still has an impact today. It was not original bottling, but about natural wine. The term natural wine was expressly banned. And this was a unique process in the German legal history. This ban was not trivial. After all, many of the later members of the VDNV, founded in 1910, had established the world reputation of the Hocks and Moselles with their so-called natural wines. And when it became apparent in the 1960s that the term could be banned, the natural wine auctioneers even claimed an encroachment on fundamental rights without success. Because natural wine was and is no more self-explanatory than orange wine, or in the field of food law, the designation bio or organic. And wasn't every must treated with various chemicals during fermentation and aging to prevent the wine from becoming what its nature was, namely vinegar? One could have argued about all of that, from deacidification to microbiological stabilization, cold sterile filling, pasteurization, or carbonic filling. But the natural wine auctioneers had lost their power of definition, so that in the negotiation process within the DWV, they were defeated by the cooperatives and representatives of the wine trade. But how was this possible? For one thing, there were quite a few natural wine auctioneers themselves who, after many bad wine years in the post-war decades, had lost faith in the top qualities that could often only be achieved in steep, slow viticulture. In some vintages, even the worst musts were improved, and more left the VDNV. And the worst musts actually were improved in those bad years, and they were encouraged in this by wine-growing advisors who, in view of steep and terraced vineyards, spoke of old, unremunerative viticulture. Moreover, the natural wine auctioneers were working against what had already been called the Zeitgeist in the 19th century. They had an interest in reserving predicates such as Späth or Auslese for wines with a high initial must weight in the 1930s wine law, not least because, as a rule, they, and only they, had vineyards in which the grapes became fully ripe in ordinary years. After the Second World War, these natural wines accounted for an even smaller share of wine production in Germany than they already did, below 2%. In the Federal Republic, the natural wine auctioneers no longer set the tone in the German wine growers associations, but wine growers cooperatives and the large wineries. They could not be interested in the privileged treatment of natural wines by the wine law. So was the mass of German wines to be forever stigmatized as non-natural? And even then, when dry or wet improved wines met the taste of the public far better than a must that had been naturally vinified with small amounts of natural sugar and exorbitantly high acidity. The prohibition of the term natural wine by the wine law of 1969-71 was therefore not only justifiable from this point of view, it was also a consequence of the shift in the balance of power within German viticulture and, never forget, the enforcement of a new social model in the field of viticulture. The origin, often based on privileges and old ownership relationships, was no longer to be the yardstick by which to judge a wine, but the quality in the glass, to be determined according to objective criteria. Insofar, the wine law of 1971, with its prohibition of the prefix nature, which is also based on European law and thus an authentic mirror of its time, which also applies to the introduction of Bereiche und Großlagen. Both terms had factual predecessors in the wine laws of 1931. In the case of the Großlage, the Grand Cru, it was the denomination nearby, same value, same type. However, this formulation offered so much leeway that time and again courts had to clarify which wines could be marketed under the best possible sounding vineyard name. For details, please spare me the explanation. In order to put an end to these disputes, it was possible to form Großlagen from nearby vineyards, whose catchment area was undisputed by defining the individual vineyards that fell under it. And again, it was hoped to kill a second fly with only one stone. In important exporting countries such as the United Kingdom and the United States, German denomination law had always been criticized as a book with 7 seals. Large vineyards, Großlagen or the Grand Crus, now offered the possibility of bringing large quantities of wine grown under similar conditions to the market in a recognizable way, if one did not want to resort to brand names. But the intentions of the legislator, the forces behind him, are one thing, effects are another. By handing over the definition of Großlagen of the Grand Crus to regional, even local bodies, one gave the power of definition to those who also had the most power in real terms. An example. In Nierstein, a handful of export-oriented wineries dominated the wine market. What could be more obvious than to take the best-known names of the best individual vineyards and designate them as Großlagen, as Grand Crus, in order to increase export quantities? Offlangen and Rehbach disappeared as individual vineyards and reappeared as Großlagen, as Grand Crus. And under quality considerations, an insane decision. From the commercial point of view, consistent. On y soit qui mal y pense. For strategies of this kind were sorely needed. The German wine market had not been able to absorb the quantities that were produced in average years alone after land consolidation and the planting of new high-performance clones for years. And it was exports that initially proved to be a highly profitable and, in view of a stagnating domestic market, urgently needed pressure relief valve for wineries. However, this business model was lost in the 1980s when a combination of wine scandals and huge harvests caused the market to largely collapse, both at home and abroad. And even VDP outfits were involved in these scandals. Everybody thinks of Austria when you think of wine scandals. The development was similar there for a long time. However, the paths have diverged since the 80s. While Austrian wine is rushing from record to record in the domestic market as well as in exports, the clocks in German viticulture are running backwards again in most market segments. Maybe in this respect it would be worthwhile to evaluate the actions of the Austrian ÖWM in comparison with those of the German Wine Institute. My layman's guess is, in this context, that Austria has been focusing on profiling its top wines and sending clear, easy-to-decipher messages to consumers since the mid-1990s. But for this, it needed the scandal of 1985, which swept numerous players from the market who had a great deal of veto power because they had been economically successful in relying on sweet and cheap. In Germany, however, in 2021, cooperative associations are leaving the German Wine Growers Association because their veto power is no longer great enough to prevent them from practicing the organized consumer deception called Großlage, Grand Cru, unhindered. What am I trying to say? It is typical of the wine market that the interests of the various groups of wine distributors are not always congruent, but sometimes even diametrically opposed. This makes wine law one of the most exciting subjects of historiographical research, if one were to pursue it. For the time being, a few glances at history must suffice to show that wine law is something of a seismograph, albeit a multi-layered one. It not only reflects power relations on the side of production and distribution, it also reflects dynamics, and Mrs. Klöckner already mentioned this, on the side of the natural preconditions of viticulture, climate change, and also the change of zeitgeist on the side of consumers. And if one also looks at the field of politics, a remarkable dynamic can be observed here as well. And I am not only referring to the processes such as the Europeanization of wine law, but which has actually lasted for more than 50 years now, but also the goals that the legislators are pursuing through legislation and the relevant regulation. The most important lawyer in wine law, highly recognized director at the Alzey Court, Hans-Jürgen Koch, already said the following, and I quote, "The wine law is a commercial law. It contains criminal law, competition law elements, and purely commercial elements with the aim of retaining vintner's profession for cultural, food, and labor considerations through measures to promote sales and to protect German wine against the competition from abroad." Unquote, Koch. This was published by the Meininger Verlag in 1958. He was trying to say the historical agenda of the wine law basically starts in medieval times. This brings me to the ballpen again. It is easy to show that politics often came into play at a rather late stage in these processes and in a more moderated way, without even their own agenda. In the imperial times and during the Weimar Republic, pre-parliamentary bodies such as wine parliaments and advisory councils served as forums where representatives of different groups of stakeholders met again and again, and by no means without conflict. In the post-war period, it was various working groups within the DWV that set the course for new legislation. And the history of the most recent wine law will one day also have to be described as a complex negotiation process. There was only one phase in German history that was less complex because it was more undemocratic, during the National Socialist era. During that era, the Reichsnährstand issued many regulations by decree. Their prime aim was, outwardly, to prevent a wine growers' emergency, as in the years before the First World War and the second half of the 1920s, up to and including 1933. Above all, the expansion of vineyards in climatically unfavorable flood areas was to be avoided. Well, National Socialists, of course, had several ideas underlying limiting the expansion into flat areas. This was to benefit the so-called food freedom for crops, for instance, and at the same time, they also want to put a stop to the production of wines that tended to be of inferior quality and possibly unsaleable. The National Socialists in 1933-34 even tried to establish a wine export body in Frankfurt to prevent the wine that was not saleable in Germany was actually exported to other countries. Under democratic conditions, this would not be possible, but the underlying idea was really striking. It cannot be repeated often enough that most of the provisions of the Reichsnährstand, in combination with the wine law of 1930, remained in force well into the time of the February Republic. These include not only, but also the reservation of approval for the planting of vineyards. It also includes the specification of a range of vines and the provision that vineyards should not be planted in mixed sets. Today, the opinion can be heard here and there that the Nazis had thus transferred their racial biological ideas of purity to viticulture. Unfortunately, nearly all of the Nazis' viticultural policy initiatives had been conceived by the viticulture experts of the Weimar Republic, but did not make it into the wine law of 1930. The Nazis limited viticulture to a few quality grape varieties simply because there was only enough recognized yield-safe and disease-free grafting material for a few varieties. But millions of graftings had to be done every year in order to actually cope with the quantities needed. And that is the next step. But if the vineyards could be planted with efficient material, then there would be no need to plant several grape varieties in such a way that one brought the acidity, the other the quantity, and the third the bouquet, so that in most bad years one had a reasonably drinkable wine. For regulations like these, they had a clear term at the time. This was the so-called modern viticulture. While these regulations lasted for a long time, other elements of the wine law of the 30s and 40s were already showing strong signs of disintegration in the 1950s. Many provisions of denomination, or such as the famous Spätlese, had already fallen into obscurity in the early post-war period due to this moral low of many legal comrades, according to the wine law expert Hans-Jörg Koch again. Koch was referring to the fact that with the denomination of Spätlese, a lot of abuse was done. In theory, a Spätlese presupposes fully ripe grapes, which actually results in a higher alcohol content. But the wine law, nobody knows why, did not foresee a minimum alcohol content for Spätlesen. And this is why it depended on a tasting whether the wine actually had the character of a Spätlese. Well, forget about the rest. The binding of predicates to must weight as an objective yardstick was only the logical consequence, unanimously welcomed by all experts in the 60s. But when policymakers left the determination of the respective minimum must weights to the regional wine growing organizations, the door was open to other forms of moral low. Let me quote Mr. Koch again. These left no stone unturned to create maximum competitive advantages for themselves by setting the minimum must weights as low as possible. There's an important lesson to be learned for me in this. To this day, it is the decision of the legislator to leave highly sensitive balancing processes to the power play within the professional organizations that lead to conflicts such as the one over the Großlage or the Großes Gewächs, the Grand Cru. History, on the other hand, in my view, should teach us at least that wine law must be about making any form of free riding more difficult, if not completely impossible. By this I mean that no incentive should be set to favor free rider effects at the expense of clarity and truth, but also of quality. The will to put a stop to such tendencies has fortunately been shown in the recent change of the denomination law. However, in my opinion, it could be even greater in all parties. However, in fairness, it must be admitted that policymakers are not always the sole masters of procedures. From time to time, courts also came into play. The most momentous of these was probably the Wiesenurteil of the Federal Court of Justice in 1957, which de facto largely annulled the cultivation restrictions that had been enforced since the mid-1930s. The Wine Economy Act, which was subsequently passed in 1961, was no longer able to prevent the expansion of vineyards, especially in the high-yielding flat areas, despite all its declarations to the contrary. This posed a dilemma for viticulture policy. On the one hand, the per capita consumption had failed to keep pace with the increase in production, and the per capita consumption of beer had exploded, that of wine had increased only slightly. The area under vines, however, had increased since the end of the war, as had the productivity per hectare. Panic spread in the wine-growing industry, for all of the experts expected that the establishment of a common market organization for wine by the Council of the European Economic Community, which had been planned since 1962, would mean that German producers could no longer be protected from foreign competition by import restrictions. So, under pressure from the German Wine Growers Association, the leading wine politicians increasingly shifted to measures to promote sales on the one hand and intervention regulations on the other in order to remove surplus quantities from the market. To this end, in 1961, a stabilization fund for wine was set up in the legal form of an institution under public law, which was fed by the levies of the wine producers. This story, too, should be researched at leisure. whether the positive remembrances of the actors will remain positive, well, I'll leave it at that. Well, what I wanted to tell is the history of wine law as an immensely dynamic field of law, despite an immensely high density of regulations. This is largely due to the fact that wine law has to take into account more different objectives than almost any other law. Accordingly, numerous actors are highly dissatisfied because they, from their own perspectives, can always imagine different and better conditions for themselves. One should imagine, therefore, wine law as a three-dimensional and by no means symmetrical body with a variable number of corner points and connecting lines of different lengths between these individual points. With this, however, almost every shift of one point automatically causes a change in the coordinates of the others and a shortening or lengthening of the wine lines between the individual points. Seen in this slide, every battle is worthwhile, even that of the small David VDP against the Goliaths of the German wine world. Those who are not at the table will probably have a hard time having their say, but it is worth it, as hindsight shows. All in all, the development of wine law from its beginnings until today is a success story to me, especially from the consumer's point of view. Wine is still a natural product and one that, thanks to a high density of regulations at all levels, is now subject to higher quality requirements than ever before, from simple table wines to the rare varieties that are sought after worldwide. And the reputation is also so good that we are at least among the best white wines in the world, and some white wines now too. There are also strict limits to the everlasting temptation to enrich oneself by deceiving consumers and by all kinds of fraud on the wine market. At the same time, the boundaries of what is prohibited and what is permitted are not rigid but fluid. Extensive experimental regulations, for example, ensure that innovations in cellar technology and new wine treatment methods are not excluded per se. So, in the midst of the current excitement, I would like to conclude with a sentence that went down in the history of German parliamentarianism through the SPD politician Herbert Wehner, but can claim validity for many life situations. He said, "Who goes out must also come in again." The VDP has long been a member of the DWV, again, of the German Wine Growing Association, and many others who have left will leave, will come back soon too. Thank you very much. Dear Daniel, thank you very much for this exciting lecture. We are accustomed to these eye-openers, these historical eye-openers, history that actually makes references to our history. As the honorary pin wearer, we are always happy to have you with us, and we would like to congratulate you on your latest award. It's a little heavy. Oh, I came with a bicycle. I came by bike. Well, have it, please. And thank you very much, and congratulations. Well, Mrs. Klöckner already said, or actually complained about being actually served water. And this is why it's high time to invite you to a little reception with wine now. And for 2 minutes, there is a little film about our VDP world. And then I look forward to seeing you on the other side of this room. Thank you very much for your attention.